Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Strategies for How to Attract and Train the Best Volunteers. And nice to meet you. If this is your first time attending one of these, I am Rachel Woody, owner of Rachel Christine Consulting, and I specialize in establishing new or re-emerging collection programs. I have 15 years of experience in archives, museums, and cultural heritage organizations, and with that comes extensive experience working with all levels of staff, volunteers, and interns. Just a few items of housekeeping before we get going. This session is pre-recorded so that I can deliver the maximum amount of information and answer any of your follow-up questions in the chat box if you're attending this premiere live. And a link to this recording and to any of the resources I talk about here or in the chat box will be sent in an email to those who registered the next day, so within 24 hours. And if you're watching this on YouTube, it'll be in the YouTube show notes. So in the chat box, please feel free to share any of your own examples and resources and ask any questions that you have. And please remember to respect this content. It is my intellectual property and is subject to copyright. And one more thing, there is closed captioning provided by YouTube, both during the premiere and for the recording. So just know that down here in this corner, you can always turn that on if you need it. And there's also a full screen option if you're watching this as a premiere in the webinar room. It can be a little small on your screen depending on how you're viewing it, so you can blow that up to full screen. You can also go over to YouTube because it's premiering on YouTube as well. So there's that. And the quick disclaimer that each organization is different and strategies will vary. So while we're going to cover applicable laws and best practices for libraries, archives, and museums, obviously everybody's situation is a little bit unique. And when I work with clients one-on-one, we tailor our strategies to those on-the-ground situations. So just know that what I'm providing here are guidelines, and you will need to apply them how you see fit for your situation. And I want to start with the acknowledgement that LAMS, which is Library, Archives, and Museums, we have a long history of relying on free to low cost labor in order to keep collection work running. And due to COVID-19, LAM financial circumstances are really bad right now, and unfortunately for the foreseeable future. So I just want to acknowledge that when we get into some of the volunteer versus interns and talking about devaluing our labor collectively, that conversation is also within this context that I realize and recognize that all of us in these LAM organizations are dealing with some very hard financial realities that make having volunteers and utilizing volunteers a necessity. So what I present here is to help us get to a healthy place, but knowing that that is going to take some work towards that healthy place. And it's not an all or nothing game. So just know that I'm not viewing this as like a black and white, no gray area issue, and that it's something that we need to work towards to make our profession healthier. With that said, our objectives are going to be talking about the ethics of volunteer programs, and that will be referencing some applicable federal law and also best practices. We're going to dig in a little bit to volunteers versus interns because there is some very important differences between the two. And then we'll get into how to attract with a volunteer program, how to recruit, train, manage, and retain volunteers for your volunteer program. Because as many of you know who have worked with volunteers, it does take a considerable amount of time and effort to thoughtfully create activities for volunteers, to bring them on board, to train them, to manage them, etc. Having volunteers is wonderful and can help us get a lot of work done, but they're also a lot of work in and of themselves. And if you're having a high rate of volunteer turnover, that means more and more of your time is being used to try and bring on volunteers and train them. So that retention piece is really key here. And all of the steps that we go through is with an eye towards making these activities more sustainable for you and also make it a more solid, consistent environment for volunteers to feel confident in. So, did you know the majority of people working in museums, so museum specific stat here, but you can extrapolate, the majority of people are volunteers. The last national financial survey from the American Alliance of Museums, which was 2009, so it was a while ago, but at that point in time, they reported a median figure of about 6 volunteers for every paid staff member. That ratio increased 18 to 1, so 18 volunteers to one staff member in museums with budgets under 250,000. And then, even with the largest museums, we're still getting 2 volunteers to every one paid staff member. And that comes from Elizabeth Merritt, who's the founder and director of the Center for the Future of Museums. So, whether you're a museum, a library, or archives, for many of us, especially when we've been in smaller organizations, we know that volunteers can sometimes make up the majority and outnumber the amount of paid staff members on site. And while that can be a wonderful thing to have a huge roster of volunteers, there's also some problems that we need to navigate with that. So, with that stat in mind, let's move on. Getting into the ethics. So, with volunteer programs, and especially in the last few years, as the devaluation of collection work and the devaluation of humanities in general has become a very pressing and urgent issue, with that has come some very valid critiques of how we do business. And part of that is having a volunteer program where people come in, they are not compensated, and some of them may be doing collection work that may otherwise have been a paid position, which is problematic. So, when we're thinking about the ethics of creating and running a volunteer program, we need to keep these in mind. And whatever program we create, we need to make sure that it doesn't devalue collection work. And when I say collection work, I'm using that as a broad term to help capture what it is that we do in libraries, archives, and museums. The next point of ethics that we want to make sure we're aware of is that it doesn't take advantage of humans. And so, thinking of our volunteers and the program that we run, we need to make sure that we are running it ethically and that it's not taking advantage of volunteers. And we'll get into that mutually beneficial relationship a little bit more later on. The next point is that we don't want to have a volunteer program that undermines our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And specifically, what I mean by this is that DEI initiatives, when we're applying it in the volunteer sphere, it really does go back to making sure that we're not having volunteers do activities that take away from paid work. This gets to the heart of socioeconomics and how race often plays a part in people having different socioeconomic statuses and whether or not that allows us to work for free, so to speak. So we need to make sure, again, that there's this clear separation and that we're creating this volunteer program ethically that's not taking away or undermining from any DEI initiatives. And then we also need to make sure that we're facilitating a mutually beneficial relationship, and we'll get into that in a minute. So, volunteers versus interns. There's a difference between volunteers and interns, and that needs to be very clear when you're setting up your volunteer program. Whether or not you're going to have interns, you do need to make sure that you're not bleeding into this is actually really an internship area. And this is to ensure that you're adhering to federal labor laws as well as any best practices you have in the library, archives, museum world. Also, you need to reference, as most of us have at this point, our DEAI initiatives, so diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. And then, of course, the Department of Labor Standards. And I will be dropping links in the chat for this, as well as in the YouTube show notes, so you'll have access to these links. So to get into this a little bit more specifically, Volunteers are defined as such. So, volunteers are allowed in nonprofit and government sectors according to federal labor laws. They are not allowed at for profit organizations. And for volunteers, they've either completed a career and they are retired, or a volunteer has a current career but it's outside of the library, archive, museum field. So, right there, that's like already a difference, volunteers versus interns. Volunteers, they're not trying to make a career in the land field, whereas interns, that is exactly what they're doing and only what they're doing. For volunteers, there is no expectation of benefits in the form of compensation, reciprocity, claimed donation on taxes, or gained experience. They are not getting any of those things. Volunteers, this is very much a charitable action on their part. They're giving for the sake of giving and supporting the organization. There's the benefit and good feelings from that, of course, and they might be able to do interesting work, which is wonderful, but they're not getting any of these benefits. So there's another difference. For volunteers, the activities are to support the LAM organization as a priority. So it's not about what the volunteer wants to do. It's not about what experiences the volunteer wants versus an intern. It's the priority is on serving the LAM organization. Now, you can certainly give your volunteers interesting projects, absolutely, but that's not the priority. The priority is to support your organization. So the next one, activities support staff, not replace staff or supplement staff duties. So you can have volunteers work on activities that will support a larger project or support some of the main responsibilities of a paid staff member, but you cannot or should not be replacing paid staff duties, paid collection work with a volunteer's activity. The next point, work is conducted on a part-time basis. So I have a bad example of this. There's an organization out in the Pacific Northwest where a wealthy philanthropist set up a museum, brought in wonderful collections, did not actually fund any collection work positions, and instead relied on this model of having volunteers come in and basically work full time as curators, archivists, registrars. And that is exactly what you should not be doing. That is not a sustainable model. That is not ethical. And that actively is devaluing collection work. So, with that in mind, work is a part time. Volunteer activities are part time only. They are not full time. They are not every day. So, if you are an organization who's trying to bring in volunteers to do that much work, that is a problem for several reasons, and we need to make sure we're not doing that. And then the last one, supervision is provided on an ad hoc basis and is not a requirement of ongoing volunteer activities. So again, this is a contrast of volunteer versus intern. Volunteers, they'll get some training, they'll get some periodic check-ins, but the activities they're doing should be fairly self-monitoring, self-sustainable, and not require a lot of attention or training or supervision from staff. Now, for interns, they can be found in all organization types, sometimes paid, sometimes unpaid, though, again, we should be moving towards compensating collection work. For interns, they're currently seeking a career within the library, archive, museum field, and so thus the basis of why they're doing this internship is because they're working on getting that experience because they want to be in the field. Interns, they can receive compensation and they can do, that can be in the form of payment, experience, education, and other benefits, tangible or intangible. So there is a compensation agreement. The intern gives time and skill because they are being trained, right? They're not a general volunteer. They actually have taken some classes and have some experience. And with that, they also then get a little bit more hands-on training, a little bit more supervision. There's that give and take in terms of compensation. And again, that can be in addition to being paid for their work. For interns, their activities are primarily selected to benefit the intern and in order to increase their knowledge and experience within the field. So Remember, for the volunteers, the priority was having them do activities to support the organization, not so much having them do whatever they want to do. Whereas for interns, the priority is the reverse, where we're focusing on the intern and providing them the experience that they want to help cultivate their career. And then the last one, education and training, demonstration, and regular supervision are provided by a paid staff member at a LAM organization who has the expertise relevant to supervising the intern. And this is so specific because for interns, if they are at an organization to gain valuable experience, they need to be working with somebody who has that experience that can train them and supervise them. Knowing that some organizations are short on staff and are on the smaller side, if you don't have a paid staff member with this expertise, that doesn't mean you can't host an intern, but it does mean you need to reach out and make some partnerships with people who are in paid archivist, curator, registrar positions and work with them to see if you can establish a project or activity for an intern at your organization, but working with somebody who has those credentials and experience, because that is required for a good internship experience. All right, so let's dig into how to attract volunteers now that we've covered some of the ethics and we've covered the difference between volunteers versus interns. Now that we have that settled, let's get into how to attract volunteers to our volunteer program. So, first point is to create an appealing and appropriate project or list of activities that can be advertised along with your volunteer call. The most common mistake I see as a consultant is that organizations just put out a call for volunteers. And that certainly is the easier thing to do. I mean, we're often busy and overworked, and we don't think about creating a list of activities first. We want to get the volunteers in as soon as we can. And I definitely understand that impulse. But you will be so much more successful in attracting the right volunteers if you take a few moments to actually thoughtfully put together a list of activities you want them to do. Because for volunteers, especially since they're usually not coming from a library, archive, or museum background, they don't know what it is that you want them to do, and therefore they have no way of judging whether or not that's interesting to them, appropriate for them, if that's something that they can help with. So, point number one, just take a few moments and do some thinking ahead of time in terms of what you want volunteers to do and include that as part of your call. And then the next most common mistake is that I often don't see library archives and museums actually listing what their commitment expectations are. And so again, be upfront with what you envision that commitment to entail. And again, remember, it's supposed to be a part-time, minimal commitment thing because this is a volunteer activity. And so if it's like 5 hours a week, which is a lot for a volunteer, be upfront with that. If it's 1 hour a week or 1 hour a month or what have you, list those out. So again, the prospective volunteers can see that and self-select in terms of, oh yeah, I have 4 hours a month, no problem, I can do that. Or, oh, that's too much for me right now, I can't do that, but I'll look for something later. So second point, be upfront with what you expect the commitment to be. Next one, name the volunteer cohort to create a sense of community. And I've seen this done well a couple different ways. Having a cool, catchy, maybe somewhat corny name for your volunteer cohort lends a sense of prestige in terms of it's a program that you are actively cultivating. It's something that you and the organization are proud of. It lends a sort of gravitas to the experience for the volunteers, and it gives them something to brag about. For example, if they were working at a museum or an archive, especially since people in the general public don't always know what an archive is, it's sort of not as exciting to be like, oh, well, I volunteer at the such and such archives or museum. Whereas if you had a cool name, you could be like, oh, well, I'm one of the red vests at such and such museum. In that particular museum, actually, like every volunteer got their own red vest with their name on it. And so it just, small things like that lend a sense of community and lend a sense of sort of bragging rights for the volunteers to be a part of that select community. So take some time to get creative about that, because it doesn't take a lot to create that sense of community, and it really helps you with that attraction. Next point is to advertise the opportunity to the larger community and be creative about where you find them. And what I mean by this is volunteers, when we're thinking about the demographics of them, they're going to be geographically approximate typically. Though with COVID, we are now coming up with remote volunteer opportunities, which means they don't need to be geographically proximate, but that is a whole separate webinar on that. So, so thinking about your community, whether it's virtual or physical, and finding where to tap into that. There was a great post on the Archives Aware blog recently, and I'll drop a link for it. And while the particular example was to do outreach, the larger point was is that this particular archivist was using Reddit and the local Reddit communities for her geographic region to share cool things about her collection. And so knowing that Reddit, for example, can be such a great community forum, and it helps gather geographically approximate people in those little sub forums, you can pop into local history. You can pop into local history for your community, your town, and post these opportunities there where your community is. And so the larger point being, find your community physically and within these online forums to advertise and help attract these volunteers. Because where these communities are most active, you're going to find people who are very interested and want to be active in what you're doing. And then last, create a referral network with existing volunteers. They are going to be your best advocates. So when you create a volunteer program and you create something that volunteers are excited and proud about, they're going to tell all their friends, they're going to talk about it, they're going to share their experiences, whether on Facebook or with their families. And so actually use that energy and use your volunteers as your best assets in terms of getting the word out and helping to attract other volunteers. And if you're looking for like some specifics in terms of, oh, I need 2 more volunteers for this event, or I need 2 more volunteers for this, ask your volunteers to recommend people. And maybe you reward them with like a $5 coffee card or something, like, some little motivational, like, gratitude to help bring in and encourage volunteers to select people who would probably be a very good fit for growing your volunteer program. So those are my top 5 points for how to do the attraction part of attracting volunteer attention. Next is recruiting. So you might attract potential volunteers, but now you need to recruit them and convert them and put them into your program. So first point to think about is how you do signups. Do you do interviews? Do you do like an open house or a show and tell as sort of like a, here's what you could be working on, and have it sort of be a forum for volunteers to determine whether or not they want to work with you, depending on how large your organization is and what your capacity is and current pandemic realities. This may or may not be a big thing that we focus on for right now, but just think about the different venues you can have where you can invite these volunteers in, so to speak, and have conversations with them in terms of, in an informal way, you sort of filling out and vetting, is this a good fit for us? Is this going to work out? And for, the reverse, for volunteers, they also want to know, okay, what would it be like to work in here? What does the work look like? Who would I be working with? So have sort of an informal setting where you can have that mutual sort of vetting process between you and the potential volunteers. During any sort of conversation you have, informal interview, etc., solicit their interests and past experience so that you can match them up best with potential activities. And I know we talked about how the priority is not on doing whatever the volunteer wants to do, which is a common mistake I see all the time. However, that doesn't mean that we ignore what they're interested in or what they're good at, because if they're interested and or have the experience and skill to do the activity, then they're going to enjoy it more. And that is perfectly acceptable as long as we're making sure that the priority is still on serving the organization first. And then when new volunteer activities become available, put out a new call for volunteers to promote that new opportunity. So if you are actively developing your volunteer program, which most of us are in a perpetual state of doing that because volunteers come and go, do a periodic, maybe every couple months or twice a year, etc., for putting out a new, I need 2 more volunteers for this activity, or we're looking to grow our volunteer community and add 5 more people for these types of things. So just remember that when you're doing this recruitment piece, it needs to be periodic, and it's going to be something that you do periodic all the time until you may reach full capacity, which never lasts long in my experience. But just know that this is a consistent activity that you need to do. And then the last one is consider personalizing the request and reaching out on a one-on-one basis when making the ask. And so making the ask is language usually when we're talking about donor cultivation, but this is another form of this in terms of for volunteers, we are asking them to donate their time and attention and energy to some of the work that we're doing. And you are always going to get more thoughtful consideration on the part of the volunteer if you reach out and ask them directly. So if you have people in mind, if you have someone who was referred by one of your existing volunteers, reaching out with a personalized email or phone call and asking them if they would be interested is so much more interesting to that person. There's some flattery and ego involved, but also just the thoughtfulness of having you do that one-on-one ask indicates to them that this actually would be a really good fit because you've put that thought into it. So consider making those asks individually, especially if you have a really good potential match with an activity. Getting into training now, and let me see if I can move my little window up. Okay, there we go. So thinking about training, rule number 1, use common general language. If those of you attended the last webinar, Breaking with Tradition, and I'll drop a link in it, while we were talking about communities that are not traditional, we do talk about how words matter. And so if you're interested in more about that, check out that webinar. But my point for here is that, again, because volunteers aren't part of the library archive museum world, because again, that's an intern if that's the case, they are not familiar with the lingo, the acronyms, the archival theory, the catalog lingo, and it is a foreign language and one that that we have been in forever. And so we just need to remember that we need to bring this back down. We need to use common language and general language, especially for introducing some harder for them concepts. So rule number 1. Second part is to be consistent and model the behavior you want to see. And this might sound really obvious, but it is a mistake that I see more often than I would like, where someone does a training and then that staff member then goes and has a cup of coffee while they're working on collections. And it's just like, if your volunteers slash interns see that, then whatever you told them loses all meaning. So just make sure that you're modeling the behavior that you want to see. Another point to consider is that providing hands-on experience and examples helps to illustrate your point. So many of us are visual learners and tactile learners. And so having those examples, especially in a physical sense, depending on the activity, helps to reinforce that learning process. Another thing to help is to provide an orientation to the organization, which includes the mission of the organization, common functions, a tour of the physical space and the virtual space, especially if the volunteers are doing digital work, and an introduction to pertinent staff. And this should also include where are the bathrooms, where can they have a break, where is it appropriate for them to go have a snack, If something happens, a health and safety issue, what staff member did they go see, things like that. All of this helps to provide the volunteer with the information they need for the daily operations that may have nothing to do with their volunteer activity, but have everything to do with making them feel comfortable being in your space. The next point, which is perhaps the most important, is creating training materials in several modalities and offering an easy to find guidelines that they can reference during their work. What I mean by several modalities is different learning styles slash abilities. And for most of my training materials, what I have found is the most effective is typing them out, grabbing screenshots or pictures if it's a physical work versus digital work, and having it step by step, having the text in terms of step one, we're doing this, having an image, and each step with text and an image, even if you think it's repetitive, it helps reinforce for the volunteer that, okay, if it looks like this, I'm doing it right and we're good and I can move to the next step. So having that, and then depending on what the work is, filming yourself, especially if it is digital work, filming yourself actually doing the activity that they can either watch visually with closed captioning, which YouTube does for free as an aside. If you need that help, you can even have your videos unlisted but captioned. And also having that audio file if you have people who um, maybe are visually impaired but can still do different digital work and can use that audio training. So thinking about the different modalities, learning abilities, etc., and how we can help provide training materials to each of those. And these are tremendously helpful because they can be referenced at any point by anyone. So when you do the training and you do the hands-on example, especially for volunteers who might be coming in once a week, once a month, etc., having that ready reference material, whether it's the text or the visuals or the video or the audio, helps to refresh their memory and it helps them feel more confident in what they are doing because they have that to reference. They're not going to feel bad like, oh, I'm going to have to ask her to show me that again. So we're really trying to reinforce not only supporting accessibility to support volunteers doing these activities, but also helping make this a more comfortable and confident experience for them doing this work. And by doing this, you're also cutting down on any sort of mistakes that might be made. And you'll also be creating a more sustainable training program by having all of this created so that you do it once. And while you do the hands-on training orientation for each volunteer who comes in, you don't need to recreate the wheel or retrain or refresh memory after that. So this is an excellent sustainability point as well. And the last one that is also so important is to create a patient and safe environment that encourages volunteers to ask questions and know it's okay that mistakes happen. This is so important, especially for libraries, archives, and museums. What we work on is unique and sometimes irreplaceable, but mistakes do happen, and they need volunteers and interns need to feel comfortable when those do happen because they will. You can create a wonderful training program and eliminate most of those mistakes, but they can still happen, and that is okay. They need to feel comfortable in that because if they don't, they're not going to feel comfortable working or doing the activities that they're doing. It's going to slow down their work and they'll actually have the potential to make more mistakes because they don't feel comfortable asking you or having you check the work. So you have to create that welcoming, safe environment where questions are welcome, where it doesn't matter how many times they ask you to show them something, you are patient and you are happy to show them again or have the video set up again for them because you've filmed it. And that it's okay if and when they make mistakes. And when I was working with students specifically, this was such an important point where I told them there is nothing you can do that I can't fix. So whether they're in the database and they accidentally delete something, which with database controls, they usually couldn't do too much, it's fine, I can fix it. If they are rehousing documents, for example, and they accidentally rip one, it's okay. It's sad that it happened, but I can fix it with Japanese tissue paper. And I actually teach them how to fix it. So creating a safe environment is so important for people to feel comfortable and to do the work that you want them to do and have them feel happy in that. Now to the management piece, and this is going to help with your retention, which we'll get into in a minute, but you need to cultivate a great management practice in order to have a healthy volunteer program. So the first point is when introducing a new activity, you need to be clear on how the work should be done and what the final outcome will look like. If you don't give specifics or show them how you want it done, they're going to do it how it makes sense for them, which usually never lines up with how it makes sense for you. So you need to actually articulate that. And you need to show them or describe to them what you want the final outcome to look like, because honestly, they're going to have no idea, especially with volunteers who, again, are not familiar with our field and our industry. You need to be very clear with what a successful outcome looks like so that they know when they get there. The next point, they need to provide an estimated time to completion and highlight any deadlines. So if they're working on an activity that's not like an ongoing thing or just a as you have time thing, if there's deadlines, if there's milestones, you need to be clear about that as part of the expectation setting and making sure it lines up with their own abilities and expectations in terms of what they thought their time commitment was. The next point is to provide a bigger picture view of how this activity feeds into another. So if you have volunteer activities that will then turn into a different volunteer activity and so on, which is a lot of what our work is, you need to be clear about that because that gives them additional contextual information into what the work they're doing now, how it should be done, why it matters, because it's going into something else later on. So that is such an important piece of context they need to know to do the job well. The next thing to think about, especially when you're thinking about long-term retention and management of volunteers, is purposefully and thoughtfully scaffolding the activities to create discrete and easy to achieve tasks that build on previous work done. So what I mean by this is if you've got a somewhat longer term project that has a couple different identified activities as you move on, those activities need to be sectioned out so that they can be completed by one volunteer. And then if that volunteer moves on to something else, a different volunteer can successfully take over with that next task. And from a sustainability standpoint, because they're volunteers, you don't know how long you have them. So having those chunked out where the activity or project doesn't die because you lost that volunteer, this is a smarter way to do it in terms of anybody can come in and continue on with this work. This also helps the volunteers because, again, this is a part-time, at their convenience thing. They know that they can come in, do these activities. If they have to go or if they want to do something else, they can, and somebody else can come in and do that next part of the activity. Or if they're a volunteer who's super into it and can stay for the duration of these multiple phases, it also helps them in terms of, okay, I know I'm in phase one, it's going to last about this long, and then phase two is something different. And this is particularly helpful when you're having volunteers do activities that aren't necessarily very interesting to them, because again, they're volunteers. The priority is to help the organization. It's not always about their interests. But if they know the activity is going to switch into something more interesting, they will be more motivated to get through phase one so that they can get to a more interesting phase two. So multiple reasons as to why scaffolding a project is better for you from a sustainability standpoint, a project success standpoint, and a volunteer interest standpoint. And finally, schedule regular check-ins to review work done, answer questions, and discuss next steps. And this is a common mistake I see in management in general across the LAM organizations, where managers, for whatever reason, don't prioritize the actual management and cultivation of the people they are managing. which is a huge mistake, both in terms of just good people management, but also in terms of successful project management. So, depending on how frequently you're seeing your volunteers, schedule a check in that makes sense. So, if you have someone coming in weekly, you should be checking in with them weekly. Someone coming in monthly, check in with them monthly. Things like that to make sure that you are aware with how the project is going. This makes it easier for you to spot and correct mistakes if they're happening. This also helps to reinforce to the volunteer that you care about the work that they are doing, and it helps them feel more confident because you've recently been to see the work and they know they're doing it right, which helps them continue to do things productively and correctly. And this also helps to reinforce this is a safe environment. You have access to me to ask the questions you need. From a sustainability standpoint, these regular check-ins are so helpful for you because if you have limited time, but the volunteer knows that they're going to see you at the end of their shift, they will save their questions because they know they're going to see you at the end of their shift to ask those questions. Whereas when you don't have regular check-ins, for the volunteers who feel comfortable asking questions, they will ask them whenever it is convenient for them for as many times as they want. And that's not good for either of you. So, regular check ins, please. And retention. Have a solid training and management practice in place, which we covered in the previous slides. Periodically host gatherings for volunteers to get to know each other and the staff. That helps create that community feeling and helps them learn what other people are working on, what they might be interested in helping with, and what other staff they might want to work for or might be a good fit for. So it serves just to create a much better environment for them. And please, gratitude is free. And I will never understand why so many of us in this field don't express gratitude for the people who help us do our work. So please, gratitude is free. You need to regularly thank your volunteers at every shift. They are coming in and donating their time, talent, expertise. Thank you. You also need to praise them when they're doing a good job so that they can build their confidence in the work that they're doing and feel that you are grateful and appreciative of the work that they're doing. You need to show off their work. You need to cite and point out and brag about their work, and you need to include them in all appropriate forums. One super sad story that I have is there were a team of volunteers that did such great work supporting an exhibition that was coming up with the community, and they were not invited to the opening reception. And it was just such an insult and such a missed opportunity to thank them and include them in the celebration of the culmination of that work. So don't be a jerk. Gratitude is free. Do all of these things so that your volunteers feel appreciated and want to be there working with you. So, what's next for you now that we've covered all of these things? I want you to select and designate discrete volunteer activities and verify that they do not replace paid work. These are activities to support the organization that can or cannot be done by volunteers. Next, articulate the what's in it for them principle to guarantee a mutually beneficial relationship and that benefit doesn't violate labor laws or best practices. So remember, volunteers are not getting compensated. They're not doing this for the experience. That's an intern. But there's still that what's in it for them. And that's the feel good feeling, that's supporting the organization, that's cultivating their interest in whatever it is that they're interested in that attracted them to your organization. So thinking about that and thinking about those attraction factors like the Red Vest Club or whatever name you give to your volunteer program. And next, gather a list of spaces, virtual and physical, to recruit volunteers in the community. So if you remember the Reddit example that we talked about, but thinking of, creatively, virtually and physically, where does your local community naturally gather? And there's already interest and interaction and dialogue happening that you can tap into so that you don't have to create it from scratch or send out these volunteer calls that are just going nowhere and are seen or heard by no one. And what's next continued? Create a volunteer policy and process for recruitment and training. So I want you to write this out in terms of what activities you're going to do the recruitment. What does the training look like? What are the components of that? Those different learning modalities and abilities. And craft the training materials and the training process to support the different learning modalities. So text, visual images for each of those steps, a video showing you doing the work, whether that's filming you doing physical work or like screen filming you describing digital work, and having that in closed captioning and also as an audio file. And for the final piece of work, as we've gone through this, you may have realized that some of the stuff you've had volunteers doing should actually really be an internship and paid work. With that in mind, I invite you to DEAI your budget and bring in funds for what should be paid work. So I'm going to drop a blog post link in here that talks about DEIA your budget, specifically about internships, but it's taking the diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion initiatives that we in the LAMS organizations are trying to move forward and do a better job at. This needs to now be reflected in your budget. So your mission statement, your DEIA initiatives, whatever it is that you say that you're doing and that you value, it needs to be reflected in what your operational budget is actually paying for. And that is usually people. You need to be able to pay people to do collection work. So I want you to think about that. Check out the blog post. And I know for many of us, funding is an issue. I'm not presenting this in a bubble. So there are grants that you can get that will help fund internships. Granting agencies are especially interested in funding student work right now and students doing collection work. So I have some grant resources I want you to check out that are free. And while it is work, and I know it is overwhelming, that this is just so important in terms of we need to get away from devaluing our work or allowing that devaluation to happen. And this is part of how we do it. We need to redo our budgets and we need to bring in funds to fund what should be paid work. Preaching to the choir, my apologies. Resources. So throughout this, I mentioned several resources. I dropped the links in. You'll also get this in your email. But for the slide deck, unpaid internships, a reason to DEAI the museum budget, what we just talked about. The Department of Labor, the Fair Labor Standards Act, so the federal law you should be following and referencing. If you're archives, we've got SAA, best practices for volunteers in archives. And then if you're museums, we have a couple resources. This one, standards and best practices for museum volunteers, and from the American Alliance of Museums, designing a museum volunteer program toolkit, another article on volunteers and museum labor, and how can we make volunteer programs more inclusive and accessible. And questions, connections. For some of you, I know that there's been some issue being able to use the chat box. So if you've not been able to, send me an email if you have any questions about any of the content that we covered today. It's consulting@rachelchristine.com. If you're interested in my services, rachelchristine.com is my website. Also, I invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter. I have several courses available. They're focused on grant writing right now. But you can check them out, members.rachelchristine.com/store. And then YouTube, where all of these webinars will end up, and there's a bit.ly link for that, /3DZPMLO. And most of you, especially if you're watching the premiere, you're already signed up for the newsletter. But if you're on YouTube and you've not signed up, going to members.rachelchristine.com/sign up will get you to my newsletter, and you'll be the first to be invited to all future webinars and content. And with that, if you're watching the premiere live, you can use the chat box. Or if you're having issue with the chat box, or if you catch this later on YouTube, please send me an email. And I'm going to leave this open for a few more minutes in case people have questions that have come to mind. And just thank you so much for joining me on this very important topic. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts about it. Hopefully you found it helpful. And if there are topics or things you'd like me to cover later on, I am working on my 2021 webinar schedule. So if there's a topic you want to see, please drop me an email and let me know what it is, and I will add it to the list. All right, thank you so much, everybody, and I'll be around for a few more minutes in the chat if you need me.